Hello there, it's just David here with my weekly message. I said I might use these videos in the next few weeks. There's nothing else particularly to talk about. Let's talk about some things that we're covering in our 10 big questions that religious people ask, but perhaps all people ask. And when I do the sort of sessions on Sunday evening and do come along, I'm going to sort of be looking at them in a slightly detached way. In other words, not kind of, putting my opinion onto other people. I'm sort of a teacher who's sort of fairly neutral, but I thought I'd use these videos because it's also fair enough to say, well, what do you think, David? So I thought I'd use these videos to say what I do think. And Sunday we're going to be talking about suffering. Why does suffering exist? Why do good people suffer? And I thought I would just reflect on that for a few minutes and what I think about it. I mean, first of all, I think the very nature of suffering means that there can't be any terribly easy answers. Suffering is either sort of physically or mentally or emotionally painful. Sometimes excruciatingly so. So it's no good saying, well, come along to an hour's seminar or, here's a little thing that'll tell you, because it's not like that. I mean, you're still suffering, you're still in pain in some way or another at the end of kind of listen to that, however well it might be explained as to what's happened. So I'm not sure that in that sense the problem of suffering can be answered. I think it can have light shed on it, however, and that's what I might tend to do. But I think therefore probably the first thing I want to do is say that, kind of the explanations we have, I'm going to be slightly, I'll go through them in a moment, slightly dismissive of, simply because I think in the end they are dismissed. And I think because if they were sort of that's it, that's sorted, then as I say, that would sort of suffering would be over, as it were, and that's obviously not true. So as I say, all of the things are partially true. None of them completely explain suffering in the world. I mean, the first thing to say is a lot of people say, well, most suffering is man-made. It's kind of our own fault. We have wars, we have crime, we have violence. We've done environmental damage, etc., etc. And that's perfectly true, of course. That's absolutely true, and we need to do what we can to stop those things. But also, it isn't completely true. I mean, you could take away all the kind of man-made suffering and evil in the world, and there would still be suffering. I mean, there are still sort of, for instance, natural phenomena completely beyond our control, nothing to do with us, not our fault, in which people suffer and die and are killed. So again, it's another thing. It's a large portion of suffering is man-made, but it isn't all. The second thing is, again, and this is partially true, and you get a bit of this in Paul's letters. Faith produces hope, produces endurance, produces character, etc. That suffering is character building. This is the kind of English public school boy view of sport, really. That you do some awful cold rugby cross country runs, you'll end up fit to be in the Indian Civil Service. And again, it's partially true, but this is a bit like your immune system, isn't it? That one of the problems with children, particularly very young children, particularly in the last couple of years, is that actually they haven't been exposed to enough kind of dirt and disease. And you need a bit of that to get your immune system going. So that's quite right. If you lived a completely feather-bed life, your sort of immune system to suffering wouldn't work. So to produce a bit of character, you do need a kind of bit of grit in the oyster. And we've all had it, haven't we? I mean, I've lived a fairly easy life, to be honest, but it's had its ups and downs, and everybody knows that, and some people have very heavy burdens to bear. But I want to say, a bit like the sort of the thing with the immune system, that's not you wouldn't sort of give your child some sort of overwhelming infection or something just to boost them up, because it's dangerous. It might do them serious damage or worse. And I think that's true of some sorts of suffering. I mean, sometimes it produces character, but also it can overwhelm. It can make people despair. It can destroy people. It can kill people. So it's no good saying it's all kind of character building. I mean, if particularly after Auschwitz and the death camps, we can't say. I mean, there are people who were slaughtered in those genocides. their characters weren't built, that'd be a horrible thing to say. So, again, it's a partial explanation, but it's not total. The third thing, which probably we hear less these days, but I think we shouldn't shy away from it. It's the view, perhaps, or one of the views of the Bible, and perhaps of societies not particularly like our own. And that is that suffering and sin are somehow related. And the question is, when people suffer, one of the cries they often make is, what have I done to deserve this? This feeling that I must have done something wrong, even if I unknowingly did, and now I'm being punished. And perhaps that's quite a natural thing to feel. And very often we want to reassure people that, of course, it's not. There's nothing that they've particularly done wrong, which means they've got this disease or had this accident. And of course, that's very obviously true. But I think it's worth just looking at the Bible, and because I don't, there's a kind of, what you get in the Bible is a rather more subtle dialogue about this. So first of all, you have to go right back to the beginning, really. This is the story, is that, if you like, in Eden, there is neither sin nor suffering, and presumably not death either. That's a debatable point. But the point is, and this is the point of the Adam and Eve story, really, is that as soon as sin and disobedience enters the world, and suffering follows. So, pain and childbirth is a result of kind of this fallenness. But it's kind of, even there, it's not sort of index linked. It's not sort of, you've done this bad thing, I will punish you. It's more kind of, somehow the whole universe is fallen, is disordered, and therefore suffering has entered it. It's kind of gone wrong, and it needs to be fixed. Ultimately, it needs to be fixed in Jesus Christ. But that's kind of jumping the gun. And so then you kind of get this reflection in the Old Testament where, it seems to be many passages do sort of say, well, if you obey God's law and do well, you'll do well. But if you sin, then, bad things will happen to you. And you can certainly find that in the Old Testament. You can find it in the New Testament as well. But also what happens then is you get a reaction to that. You get the start of a dialogue, particularly in the wisdom literature. The book of Job is a very good example, where people say, hang on a minute, I can name 10 good people who've had a pretty bad time and have died pretty unhappy. And I can name 10 people, who've, got away with murder, literally sometimes, and don't seem to have suffered terribly much. And Job is a very good example of the former of those. That's the point of the book. And so these writers are saying, hang on, it's not as obvious as this. There's very obviously, perfectly good, very good people who suffer disproportionately. And of course, you get that debate in Jesus. Was this man born blind because of his sin or because of his parents' sin? Now, again, that's another debate. So there's another excuse. Well, this person might have not done something wrong, but perhaps it was 2 or 3 generations back that did something wrong, and therefore, this has kind of come out in this generation. And actually, Jesus gives this rather sort of roundabout answer, but he does say fundamentally, actually, it's not this man's fault. It's not his parents' fault or his grandparents. It's so that, in healing him, the glory of God might be shown. And you might think, well, that's a roundabout answer. But it is an answer to the bit of the question that says, is it down to this man's sin or his parents' sin? And Jesus' answer is quite clearly neither of these things. There isn't that kind of direct link between sin and suffering. Though, of course, even in some of the healing miracles, Jesus says, your sins are forgiven, get up and walk. So that there is a kind of link, but it's a kind of a link in which the whole person is healed, not a sort of a link that says, well, you've only got this disease because you've done something bad. I think probably the final thing I would say, therefore, is, sometimes people want to, well, not sort of glorify suffering or even cause suffering or put up with suffering. But I think what Christians need to say, quite frankly, is, when you come across suffering, it's bad. It's not God's will. Um, that I mean, whenever Jesus meets a person who's suffering, he, heals them. You know, the only response to suffering is trying to alleviate it. And there's never a time when Jesus causes somebody else to suffer. I mean, you might say quite harsh things to them, that's slightly different, but he never hurts anybody. He never makes anybody's suffering increase. So I think, whenever we think about, when we come across people suffering, if we're to kind of live as disciples of Jesus, our only response can be try to alleviate that. It isn't up to us to say, oh, well, I think they're suffering because, or, oh, well, it's all parts of God's will, etc. I don't, those things may be true, but I think fundamentally, it's about, seeing through a glass darkly. All we can do as human beings is, if we see suffering, is try and prevent it. And so I think, Christians must always be on the side of healing and of peace and of alleviating suffering. And it's very important that we're seen to do that, and not either to kind of, just let it go, or to do the opposite, worse, or, try and excuse it, or even worse, to cause it. So there we are. Those are a few thoughts of mine on the problem of suffering, and so we'll be talking a bit more about that in our 10 Big Questions series. Thank you.